Here at the Sega Guys, one of our favourite topics is Sega's mission to bring the arcade home. We've talked before about Model 2 games on the Sega Saturn, the plethora of arcade ports on the Mega Drive, and even superscalers on the Sega Master System. But what about the 32X? This much maligned mushroom add-on is often cited as one of the main reasons for Sega's implosion. Its short lifespan, tiny library, and ridiculous setup earn it a label of failure in the gaming community. But it did have some good games. Near arcade perfect ports of Superscalers, Space Harrier and Afterburner for example. But they were games that were almost a decade old at the time. So what about Sega's then current arcade hardware? Well, in this episode I'll be looking at the ports of the three main Sega Model 1 arcade titles on the 32X, assess their faithfulness, their content, and whether they make the add-on worthwhile or whether its failure is complete. We'll start with Virtua Racing. It was this title that saw the debut of what would then be known as the Model 1 arcade board and was industry defining in 1992. In 1994, we'd had an SVP chip powered Mega Drive port which was extremely impressive for the hardware, all things considered. But once this 32X version released, it became the de facto version for playing Virtua Racing in the home. Virtua Racing was yet another classic from industry legend Yu Suzuki and is one of the games that popularised the use of polygons. At its core, Virtua Racing is a classic Sega arcade racing game like so many before it. And while there had been polygonal racing games before, such as Atari's Hard Driving and Namco's Winning Run, neither featured the smooth and polished gameplay coupled with what was unparalleled visual complexity at the time like Virtua Racing did. The Mega Drive port was a far cry from the arcade game, which was to be expected, but the 32X port brings things far closer than previously thought possible. Not only are all three of the arcade tracks present and faithfully recreated in Deluxe, but you also get two new courses along with two new cars. Deluxe makes near perfect use of the 32X's enhanced colour palette to produce a rich image that comes close to matching the arcade. Polygonal models too are very close and a huge improvement from the SVP powered Genesis version. The interesting thing here is that the SVP was initially conceived as an add-on cart that sounds like a mix between Sonic & Knuckles and the 32X itself. And given the similarities between the two concepts, it's astonishing that the 32X port is such an enormous upgrade. It's not perfect. The frame rate is capped at 20 frames per second and there's no collision detection on coarse objects, but it's still a phenomenal port. More than the later Saturn port, it is very much the arcade game in your home, complete with replays, and it even has a two-player mode. Even today, despite the lower frame rate, it still plays like an absolute dream, something it shares with fellow 20 frames per second racer Daytona USA on the Sega Saturn. Sega knew how to make their racing games work on their hardware, and while we may all wish that it was this team and not Time Warner that ported the game to the Saturn, we have to appreciate the wonder that is Virtua Racing Deluxe on the 32X, a game that has no right to look and run as good as it does on the hardware that it plays on. Next up is Star Wars Arcade, released on the Model 1 by AM3 in 1993. Now the force is strong with this one. Besides the obvious source material, I do get the feeling that AM3 were inspired by Atari's own 1983 vector graphic arcade Star Wars title, since the premise and many of the objectives are broadly similar. In Star Wars Arcade, you're tasked with various objectives, but for the most part, you'll be taking down TIE fighters en route to a run at the Death Star. The arcade game could be played with one or two players, with the second player taking the role of the gunner while the first pilots the ship. And this is still the case with the 32X port. You can still play solo though, and that is still a thoroughly satisfying experience. So how faithful is Star Wars Arcade on the 32X? Visually, it's as close as you could possibly hope for on the hardware. Like Virtua Racing Deluxe, there's a noticeable reduction in frame rate and geometry for the polygonal stages and models. Compared to the arcade, some of the cinematics have been cut back as well. But overall, the full gameplay experience is there. In arcade mode, the stages feature the same designs even if the visual elements, like the asteroids, are dialed back or missing. You get to dogfight TIEs, take down Star Destroyers, battle on the Death Star's surface, and do the classic trench run. What's more, as was the case with Virtua Racing Deluxe, there's extras that the arcade game doesn't have. In this instance, an entirely new campaign known as 32X mode. This adds extra stages and increases the difficulty somewhat, and while for the most part it just means variations of the same themes, it's still a most welcome addition to the package and gives players a runtime around 3 times that of the arcade original. Star Wars Arcade looks great, it sounds great, it plays great, and it has some brilliant additional content. And of course, it's Star Wars, so that just amplifies the appeal. Just like Virtua Racing Deluxe, this was like having the arcade game in your home, but unlike Virtua Racing, there was no other official port of this lost Sega classic, which means the only way to play this outside of emulation is via the 32X.
Look, S-Balls in attack positions.
3 leaders standing by. They're coming in. 3 marks at 210.
Last, we have Virtua Fighter, the legendary fighting game that changed the face of the genre and the entire industry. Star Wars Arcade and Virtua Racing Deluxe were both Sega 32X launch titles, but Virtua Fighter came a full 10 months later, which meant it came some time after the Sega Saturn's Western launch and even the release of Virtua Fighter Remix. In fact, it released extremely closely to the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter 2, which isn't the most flattering comparison. However, as they say, last is by no means least, and when you're an industry legend like Virtua Fighter, everyone should sit up and take notice. The trend continues with Virtua Fighter as it did the previous 2 games. What we have here is an extremely faithful port of an arcade original with intelligent visual cutbacks. The best news here is that unlike the prior 2 games, the frame rate of Virtua Fighter matches the arcade's 30 frames per second, so all of your move timings should be the same in the arcade as it is in the home. There is some slowdown, though it's mostly in replays. Occasionally it's in game, and while you may notice it, it's rarely intrusive. The biggest cutbacks here are in the details. Both character and stage visuals lose a lot of clarity and detail. Fighters are significantly simplified with facial details that are extremely basic during gameplay. However, remember when I said that the cutbacks were intelligent? Nowhere is this more evident than in the victory screens. In gameplay, you likely won't notice how much of the detail has been reduced as you'll be too busy with Virtua Fighter's blistering gameplay. But when characters are front and centre in the victory screens, the character models are swapped out for Sega Saturn ones, and since the victory screen only features one character, the 32X can render it without actually missing a beat. Sound though is something of a mixed bag. Now voice work is great. Using the 32X hardware you get crystal clear speech from the fighters and from the announcer, and sounds are crunching just like the arcade. However, the soundtrack is heavily neutered, either using the Mega Drive hardware itself or not entirely using the 32X to its fullest, so it pales in comparison to both the arcade and the absolutely superior Sega Saturn version. However, what this version does have, which the Sega Saturn does not, are extra modes. There's a tournament mode, which can be played with up to 8 other human players as you compete to be the Virtua Fighter champion. There's also a ranking mode, which grades you based on your performance in the game. It's much like the Saturn ports of Virtua Fighter 2 and Virtua Fighter 1, albeit in Virtua Fighter 1 on the Sega Saturn, you have to unlock it, which isn't true for the 32X version, which is unlocked at the start. These extras, coupled with the reduced flicker on characters, has led to some proclaiming that the 32X port of Virtua Fighter is better than the Saturn one. I can't say I agree, but it's still an utterly fantastic version of one of the most important video games of all time. So there we have it, 3 classic ports of the 3 biggest Sega Model 1 arcade games. Given the others were a tweaked version of Virtua Racing and an experimental VR title, these are probably the Model 1 ports that actually mattered, though it would have been nice to get the cancelled version of Wing War. As you can see, all 3 of these ports were excellent and made great use of the hardware, and that's where you have to give the 32X its due. These were games that ran on a $10,000 arcade port and were ported more than content complete and gameplay intact to a device that costs less than £170. It may have been a foolish idea, executed terribly from a commercial perspective, but as a piece of hardware, the 32X was an extremely capable device for the price. With these 3 games, it arguably brought 3D arcade gaming home intact, before anyone else. 2 of these ports are in the discussion to be the best home version of those games, and 1 still cannot be played anywhere else outside of emulation. The 32X doesn't get a lot of wins, but when it comes to these Sega Model 1 ports, they can be described as nothing other than absolute successes. This has been Dan, the Mega Driver of the Sega guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the Sega side.